in addition to welcoming two giants of the arts and the performing arts, Philip Glass and Lucinda Childs, I'm also thrilled to welcome the chief music critic of the Los Angeles Times, Mark Swed, who will be moderating. Welcome, Philip Glass, Lucinda Childs, and Mark Swed. Thank you very much.
I would like to begin by reading just a little teeny bit from an article that was in The Guardian, the British newspaper, yesterday, by a composer and someone who was for 25 years the music director of the National Theatre, who says that opera needs an overhaul at this moment. And he wrote, "The Opera House doesn't seem to have had its look back in anger moment, as the theater did in 1956, when deference to old habits, especially vocal ones, were shed overnight. Modern opera still sounds 19th century," he says. Seems to me that 20 years after this 1956 moment, there was in fact exactly that kind of thing that happened to opera. Einstein on the Beach right now is a seminal work. It's in every history of opera as something that really changed our whole perception of what opera could be. I called it a reform opera, something that did for our time what Gluck's reform operas had done for the 18th century. And yet it's a work that's been hardly ever seen. And it had its original 1976 production in Avignon, toured Europe that fall, had 2 performances at the Metropolitan Opera, and then was revived twice in 8-year spans for small periods of time. And in fact, how many people here have actually seen Einstein on the Beach? Just a couple. So maybe we should begin, Philip, by you telling us what it is. Just describing. Was
that written by Harry Birtwistle?
No, it was written by Dominic Muldowney.
Because Harry was the music director at the
National Theatre as well.
For a long time.
Okay, this is
and
Dominic
in
Muldowney.
1976, he worked very hard to try to get it to London. Mm-hmm. It happened to be the same year. You might remember that Martha Graham had a big retrospective, and there was a big American Indian exhibit. And we were told that they had spent enough money on Americans already. And we never made it there. Mm-hmm.
So can you just start this by describing the work itself?
Okay.
And what you
First of all,
made?
people, this often happened to us. We would have meetings kind of like we're having today. And people would say, they had seen it the night before, and they'd say, is this an opera? And of course, I don't think we ever thought we never thought about it, that it was an opera at all until someone asked us, and of course we said it was.
Well, Bob called everything an opera then, right?
That's right.
Every work that Robert Wilson, the co-creator of this, he called everything, all of his theater pieces were called operas, whatever they were.
Well, because that's what the word meant.
Right.
It meant work.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so we're talking about the elements of movement, image, text, and music. Mm-hmm. Those are the 4 elements. That's the earth, air, fire, water. That's all there is. In opera, all 4 of those elements come into play. And I would say that any theater work is going to participate on some level with all of these 4. Opera is the only one that uses all 4 consistently. So that there's a history of dance, of singing, of movement, of image making. All that is part of opera. That would be the first definition of it. So in that way, I would say this work that we did get certainly qualifies in that way. But there's another thing that came up that over the years that I had to respond to this kind of question mark. So it's not the first time I've heard this. And I would say, well, this is what we found out. If we wanted to do, and this is, I would say Bob from the beginning had this idea. This is more than, he articulated it very well. In order to do Einstein, you needed a proscenium stage. That's a stage like this. Mm-hmm. You needed fly space, that's what's up there. You needed wing space so people could move things on and off. You needed, I suppose there is an orchestra pit here. You could call Einstein anything you wanted to, but the only place you could do it was in an opera house. I got involved with all kinds of varying degrees of music theater and theater and dance and so forth. But when it came to doing Einstein, the only place we could do it was an opera house. So I began to think, at one point I said, well, which of the works I've done were operas and which weren't? And I then had a very ready answer. Works that are done in opera houses are operas. It has the virtue of being actually reflecting what really happens.
But describe the actual work. I mean,
are you kidding? Are you kidding me, Mark?
In 5 words or less.
Typically, it would begin at 6 o'clock, 6:30 in the evening, with a prelude that when the audience came in, and it would go on till about 11:30. One of the things, and I'm sorry that Bob is here, because Bob really, besides being our collaborator, I mean, a lot of his instincts, I have been working in theater since I was 20, but, I know that Lucinda had been working in dance for a long time. But when we began working with Bob, things began to take on a different shape, and that was true for him vis-a-vis us as well. Though he had worked with music before and dance before, but when we were working with Einstein, we were now working as collaborators in a different way. We had all the elements of opera except for one, which of course we were not interested in telling a story. And I would say that one of the distinctive things, we've talked about these elements of the image and the text and the music and movement and so forth. Music, of course. But one of the distinctive things about Einstein was that it didn't tell a story. We called it Einstein on the Beach because we had to call it something. Once we called it that, Bob began to play with the idea of who Einstein was. Well, Bob is not a great reader, but I knew a lot about Einstein, so he would grill me about Einstein, and we would talk about Einstein, and all kinds of things came up because of that. Now, what's distinctive about Einstein is that it doesn't tell the story, the audience tells the story. In other words, we were following basically, all of us, if I may speak for Lucinda too at this moment, but we were of a generation that came right after Duchamp and John Cage, and we were told and we believed, and I do to this day, that the meaning of a work is completed by the audience, that it's not inherent in the work itself, but that the transaction that happens between the performer, the authors, the performers, and the audience is what that is the transaction. What happens is what gives meaning to the work. In other words, Einstein doesn't mean anything, but we can insist that it is meaningful. And when you say it doesn't mean anything, it doesn't mean a specific thing. What would often happen in a situation like this, and we quickly got into this situation where we would ask them what they thought Einstein. We'd say, well, they would say, what is the story? And we'd say, Bob would always say, well, what do you think it is? And before you know it, we had 8, 10, 12, everyone had a different idea of what the piece had been. Everyone told the story in a different way, which of course was the point. The point of Einstein, from a theatrical point of view, was that what the audience brought to the piece became an essential part of how the piece was understood. And in that regard, I think we had somehow succeeded. I don't know that we were that prescient about it. I don't know that we were thinking about it that way so much. But we had done a quintessential audience completing the work piece. We had done that. And I don't even know, we never talked about it. We were all good friends, but we rarely talked about the work. Is that true, Lucinda? We talked about all kinds of other things. We talked about politics or life or whatever. We never talked about what the work meant. We all knew what it meant. We knew that the meaning was inherent in the transaction between the performance and the audience. In that way, if we look at it that way, then we can see why was Einstein on the Beach such so shocking in a certain way. First of all, we were in a conventional theater. We were not. I first saw Lucinda's work in the Washington Square Church, and my work could have been heard in lofts around Lower Manhattan. You never would have seen a work like Einstein in a legitimate theater, so to speak. What was shocking about it was that we took this work, these were ideas that we grew up with, that we knew about and been talked about for 30, 40 years. This was nothing new to us. What was new was that the work was now allowed to be seen in the context of traditional opera in the same hall. People would come, and this happened when Lucinda and I were doing dance later. I don't know how it happened. We ended up performing, dance was performed in dance halls, in places where dance was done. People were completely shocked. Totally. This is 1979, 3 years after Einstein. People were totally shocked by this because we were suddenly in the Théâtre Champs-Élysées in Paris, where ballets were done. And where were the tutus? Where were the shoes? Where was the story? It wasn't there. And in a certain way, dance, which if you didn't see it last night, you can see it for the next 2 nights here. Which doesn't seem so radical. At the time that we did it, it was so radical that it was not uncommon for people to throw things at us and to shout us off the stage. They didn't succeed in shouting us off. I would say that we didn't. We held our ground, and I was playing in the pit, and Lucinda was on the stage, and the company was there. But what was surprising about it was that we were taking ideas which were well known in the art world, in the world of theoretical theater, so to speak. We came out of the world of Grotowski and the Living Theater and Peter. Bob Wilson is. No one falls out of the sky. We come out of trees where there are other apples. There is a lineage to this work, but it was not known in the world of conventional theater, in the world of conventional dance, in the world of conventional opera.
Well, in fact, Einstein could be seen not as something new, but in a way as the culmination of the kind of work both you and Robert Wilson have been doing for many years.
There are two ways to look at it, Mark.
Because you then both actually went off in
I
different
prefer to
directions.
think of it as the beginning of something rather than the end. You can look at it either way.
Well, in your autobiography, which was written 25 years ago, maybe time for volume 2, your first chapter is apprenticeship of sorts, and that's 25 pages, and your second chapter is Einstein on the beach, and that's 50 pages. So you, at that point, were sort of starting your real career with Einstein.
I thought that, though I had been working in the theater since I was 20, it wasn't until I was 35 or 36 that I was able to handle the materials and the concept of a what do you call it, a most postmodern theater. That may be what people call it, but of a truly of a work which truly was based in its essence and its substance on a new way of looking at the performing arts.
Mm-hmm. Now, Lucinda, you were in the first production of Einstein and wrote some of the text, and then did choreography as well for the 2 revivals. And was that your first time working with Philip?
Yes.
Yes. And
absolutely. Yeah.
Can you maybe tell us what it was like to be in that first production?
Well, my background was coming from the Judson Dance Theater, which some
Yes.
people have heard about and nobody has seen too much of, except through the revivals that were done with the Baryshnikov White Oak Company in a program called Past Forward, where he represented some of the Judson choreographers. But I think that was the only occasion for people in this day and age to have any real contact with that period. And also I was a student of Cunningham, and therefore very much influenced by John Cage. And I was fascinated by the discipline of Cunningham dancers to dance with a music where there was no pulse of any kind. In fact, very often the Cunningham dancers never even heard the music until the night of performance.
Right.
And I was fascinated just watching them and them train for this event to be coexisting with the music of John Cage. And I felt that was in and of itself something very interesting to explore. So for many years, I worked without any kind of musical accompaniment. in a so-called silent period where, so that Philip was the first time for me being involved in Einstein and being invited by Bob Wilson to join the production. It was the first time for me to work with the composer.
And what was that like? What did you, I mean, even watching that little bit of those clips, there is so much detail that is going on. And how much of that is like with the hands and everything? How much of that is something you brought to it? How much of it is Wilson? I mean, you of kind of all people seem to have a very close aesthetic kind of sensibility to both Glass and to Wilson. I mean, it seems that you would be very close to their way of thinking, but I'm wondering how much of this is what you brought to it? How much was it Wilson's idea? How much of the music?
Well, first of all, I can say that from the background of saying that we didn't use music doesn't mean that I'm not musical.
Right.
that I was fascinated by Philip's score, and the fact that in the aesthetic that I was developing, there were some similarities in how he structures his music and how I would structure the variations in my choreography. And the question would be, well, maybe these things shouldn't be together. Maybe they're too similar. What's the point of putting them together? And so I had to think very carefully about how these structures could be put together. And I would say with Bob Wilson, the process by which we arrived at the material, the movement material, came about through structured improvisation, totally guided by Bob, opening doors for me in ways that I wouldn't necessarily expect at all coming into rehearsal. And I would say that it's really given on both sides to arrive at something that could, change from day to day.
And what were Philip and Bob like then? Tell us something about.
Well, they were. I met
they were.
Bob through a mutual friend because I had seen a performance of Letter to Queen Victoria in 1974, and it was almost like the experience of my first class with Merce Cunningham. Everything changed. I felt I walked out of that theater, I was a different person. I loved the production. And I met Bob somewhere, and I think it was in New London. I was watching a Mabel Mines performance. And he said, I'm working on this production with Philip Glass, and I'd like you to be Einstein. I mean, it just really came up like that. And then the phone rang a few months later, and he wanted to come over and see me, and he had the whole concept of the opera was already designed. And I, of course, it was thrilling for me to have it was a complete transition in my career to begin to work with him. And also Philip. I came into what was then an audition. Philip said, "Do you sing?" No, I don't sing. In any case, we got to know each other, and in the process of the first production in 1976, I created a solo for the opera. And I enjoyed that process so much, and that's how I got to know Philip. And we decided then to continue to work together. And
Philip, do you want to talk about the process of how Einstein came together, how you worked with Bob, because there was a long gestation period.
Well, it was like this. I had seen. I also saw Letter to Queen Victoria, and then shortly after that, there were some of these big pieces that were at the Brooklyn Academy of Music. I think it was The Life and Times of Sigmund Freud, wasn't it?
And Joseph Stalin.
And we met after one of those all-night performances. And we were interested in each other's work right away. I mean, he knew my work, I knew his work. So we decided that we would meet once a week when we were both in New York, and we would talk about our work. And that went on. Those meetings went on for about 6 or 8 months. And during that time, we gradually eased ourselves into thinking about our work. And the first thing, we met Christopher Knowles at that time. He was actually, I would say, the principal writer, not the only writer, because Lucinda wrote some important texts, and so did Mr. Johnson. He plays the older man who plays the part of the judge.
Tell him, Christopher Knowles was the young autistic boy who Bob had developed.
Yeah, and who, by the way, Bob had a lot to do with his becoming very socialized. He's gone way beyond being an autistic boy at this point. And that had to do with the way Bob worked with him. Bob was, he had a great interest in. I think, and he explained it to me, that he felt that there were a lot of autistic qualities of his own that he thought he understood Christopher, and they worked together anyway. So during that time, we agreed to do a work, and the first thing that Bob did, and this is the way in subsequent pieces we've worked. He says, well, the common meeting for us is time, so let's divide the time up. He said, let's do a piece, and we do a piece in 4 acts. Each act would be an hour long, and there would be these little connecting pieces. He called them knee plays because the knee connected the parts of the body. And we divided the time up into 4 acts. And then he had 3 images. He had the image of the spaceship and the trowel and the dance.
The field dances.
The field dances. Mm-hmm. Those were the 3. And then it became my job to organize the thematic material into the 4 scenes. And what I did A, B, C, A, B, C, A, B, C. That was it. He did the overall structure, I did the internal structure. So at that point we had a structure, but we didn't know what it was. At that point, Bob began doing drawings, and he said, and he had another concept, which was the foreground, the midground, and the landscape. So those also became 3 elements, visual elements. So Bob began by doing a book of drawings, and that was happening during the period that we were working, that we were having these meetings. The drawings would happen. At the end of the time, I had a complete set of drawings for an opera that no one had seen or had heard, or we had no idea. We had no idea what would happen. By that time, we had enlisted. We knew that we had Lucinda with us. There were a few other people that Bob had known, but most of the people he had worked with, and like with Letter of Queen Victoria, none of them in his former company were invited to be in this piece. He wanted a completely new company. Do you remember that happened?
With the exception of Cheryl Sutton.
Exception, a very important exception, Cheryl Sutton, who was the other woman in the scene that you saw. So then this is what happened. We began to rehearse. Now, the rehearsal day was divided in this way. We had a music rehearsal, a dance rehearsal, and a staging rehearsal, all in the same day. The music rehearsal began with my teaching that the 4 dancers had to also be singers. Now, that was part of it. We couldn't afford to have a corps de ballet and a singing ensemble. So we auditioned people that could both sing and dance. Now, that's not, in America, that's not very hard to do because song and dance people they get training at that because they all want to go be on Broadway. And we had auditions, and we had hundreds of people would show up. Bob had a wonderful eye for what a Bob Wilson performer would be like. He knew what he wanted, and he put together a dance ensemble and also a vocal ensemble. So in the morning I would be teaching them the music. Then there would be choreography. In those first periods, there was. Who was doing the original of that? Andy DeGroat did some of that. Did that. Then Lucinda,
who was a choreographer who had worked with Wilson.
But don't forget
before.
that there was very important choreography done by Lucinda in that first production. The trowel scenes and the diagonal walk. When you see anything that she's in, that's what she did. And then Bob did the staging. So basically, every day we handled all the material, and we went from the beginning, went to the end. At some point, he needed a trial. He decided the trial scene, he needed a judge, and he auditioned people and got Mr. Johnson, who also wrote his own text, by the way.
Yes, Mr. Johnson was the older judge.
Yeah, that's right.
Tell him that Mr. Johnson was quite a character,
Well, Mr.
right?
Johnson, I was invited. I did a lot of this. Were you at the auditions for Mr. Johnson also?
No.
But Bob wanted to find somebody to be the judge. He wanted 2 judges. He wanted to be a little boy and wanted an old man. That's the kind of way Bob would think about things. And a lot of people came in, and he settled on this Mr. Johnson, who was a black man. And then we had Paul Mann, I still remember who it was who now, of course, is about 40. So, but at the time he was 7 or 8. Maybe he's older then now, because that was 70, 75. We were doing that. So 35 years ago, he was be 42 now. So then we began. Then we got to the trial scene. Now this is a typical. You have to understand how we did it. We did this. You have to understand how Bob would work. And I'll give you a good story. This is how it worked. We did the trial scene. So Bob had designed this trial. He put Mr. Johnson on one side. He put the boy in and said, "Mr. Johnson, it seems to me that the judge should have something. Should say something." And Mr. Johnson said, "Yes." He said, "Yes, Mr. Wilson. The judge should say something." He said, "Could you write something for this?" And he said, "Well, yes, I can." And the next morning, the next day, he came up with a piece of writing which you can hear to this day. He did a second one called The Lice of Paris.
And this is about the equality of women?
Yeah.
Which is an extraordinary,
It's
almost Lincolnian kind of speech.
Mr. Johnson wrote his own speeches. Now, how would Bob know that he could do that? I have no idea. But, and I knew Mr. Johnson. We didn't know him very well. We called him Mr. Johnson. He called me Mr. Glass, and he called Bob Mr. Wilson. It was very formal. All the time that we knew him, we never were on a first-name basis. He would go on the road with us, and he said Bob explained to him that when he got the job, that he would have to go on the road with it. He said, well, he was in his 70s when we met him. And he said, well, the only problem, he said, Mr. Wilson, is he said, I've taken up the piano, and I need to practice every day. And Bob Simpson over to me, he said, Mr. Johnson, there's no problem. Wherever we go, there will be pianos, because we'll be playing in opera houses, and you can practice them every day. And then he also, it turned out that he was studying creative writing. He was taking a course somewhere or other. I have no idea where. So when Bob had asked him if he would write a piece, well, that was right up his alley. He was completely prepared to write his own speeches. And they were fantastic speeches. No one ever edited those speeches. And when we end up in Paris, by the way, in the first tour, unbeknownst to us, he had rewritten his piece in French. And the first night in Paris, he recited the speech in French. And we almost fainted. We had no idea he would do that. And when we were in France, he did it in French. So, the story is about two things. It's really about an amazingly intuitive person that Bob was. To be able to pull out of people like Christopher Knowles or myself or Linda or himself for that matter, to find a kind of a touchstone that allowed us to make a work together that he himself didn't anticipate. I mean, when he asked Mr. Johnson to write a speech, he had no idea what the speech would be or what it could be. And Mr. Johnson knew. But when he auditioned and he picked Mr. Johnson, how do we know? I don't know. Did he have some intuition that there was a well of creativity in Mr. Johnson that no one suspected, but Bob found it?
Now, one of the things that's always struck me about Einstein is that it's very much a visionary work, and it's a work in which audiences have this almost transformative experience, and I think a lot of us
almost, did you say?
Almost have a and some have it. Well, if you have a total transformative experience, then you're in another place. But what interests me about it is that in some ways it's really you're just doing what you had been doing, but we're all seeing it differently. I mean, your music is just a continuum of what you had been doing up to that point. I mean, your music had been developing from its early years of being extremely reductive to getting much more and more complex, and you'd done a very big work, music in 12 parts, the last 6 hours, and then you were working on another look at harmony, and that just blended right into composing.
Yeah, that was true for all three of us. That was true for Lucinda.
Right, and that's what I was going to say.
Look at the age we were. We're in our mid to late 30s.
Right, and
we all had a history of, I had been working in the theater since I was 20. Bob,
right.
He was doing theater design from the time he was a child, as far as I could tell. Lucinda, her work in theater and dance goes back to early years. You find three people, and we happened to be at a critical point, by coincidence perhaps, in our own developments, where something transformative could happen.
But what I think, what happened for at least some of us in the audience, it certainly happened for me, is that even though what you were all doing was just part of your natural growth process and becoming who you were, I think the audience saw it very differently. The audience, it all felt extremely new, and like all of this stuff we were experiencing for the first time, even if you'd seen a lot of Bob's work, if you'd heard your work, it still felt completely new.
Well, Mark, if you had been hanging out downtown at some of the Justin Church events, and if you've been...
Well, I was, and I didn't like a lot of it before, until I saw Einstein on the beach.
But you can surely,
and then suddenly it just felt amazing.
You could see what the roots of it were.
Right.
We didn't come out of the sky.
I know, but it felt like it did. And that's what I find very interesting. And that was a reaction that an awful lot of people had, is that, oh my God.
One thing that I would agree to this extent, I think what's surprising about Einstein was how mature the work was for the age that we were. However, all of us have been working in the theater and for a couple of decades. We weren't beginners. We weren't 20 years old. I was 37. I mean, I wasn't a kid anymore. This kid wasn't a kid anymore. Bob wasn't. We were at a place where we were quite well prepared to do major work because of our age and our experience in our past. And we came out of a historical context in terms of development of aesthetic ideas. We were friends with people like Jasper Johns and Bob Rauschenberg and Boris Cunningham. These were not people in books to us. These are people that we knew. John Cage, I knew him quite well. These are people that we talked to. Our mentors were an extraordinary generation of people, barely a generation older than us, barely older than us. Saul LeWitt, who was the collaborator with us on dance, he was 10 years older than us, but he was one of the older guys. And yet, if you look at this work, I mean, the contribution is enormous. And but by the way, that gives us a chance to talk about dance in a way. That dance is. It comes right after this, and you can see, and it's also, dance is not an accidental work either. It's a part of a continuum of work. The way I knew Jasper, I've known Jasper a long time, knew him quite well, and at one point, I was working with Richard Serra, helping us with his, as an assistant. We were building a piece in Jasper's, where he lived, in a bank actually. And his house guest was John Cage. And for 2 or 3 weeks, I was working in the house. And John Cage and Jasper Johns and Richard Serra and I had lunch together. So, I mean, we talked about everything. These were to put it bluntly, had we been living in, one of us in North Dakota and another person in Texas and another person in New Jersey, it never could have happened. We were living in this curious, I would say, a kind of a ratatouille of artists who were making up this downtown world. And we grew, and we came, and probably the most single important person who was the forerunner to us was Duchamp, who was well known to us, maybe not personally, but through John Cage he had been.
Right.
So the French Surrealists were they were the godfathers of the movement. When you start looking at that, now we start talking about what's the lineage of the work. We talk about it that way, it's not very surprising.
And the other interesting thing is, going in the other direction, is it became a kind of jumping off point for, I mean, both you and Lucinda wound up being in traditional opera houses, working with, in much more traditional manners, operatic manners, and Wilson as well. I mean, all three of you have become almost fixtures in a way in
Mark,
the opera.
if only that were true, but thank you for your confidence.
But no, I mean, you do an enormous amount of work in opera houses. You've written, what, 24 operas since Einstein? And two more on the way? And you've directed opera, you work in opera houses?
Yes, I do.
And choreographed, and I mean, I have to say, one of the greatest productions of an opera I've ever seen was the Moses and Aaron that, directed by Peter Stein, that Boulez conducted, and you did the choreography for, which was an extraordinary combining of forces and talents, and people coming from very different places, it seems to me. I mean, you, Boulez, and Peter Stein seem like three very different kinds of artistic personalities. But Einstein sort of was the start, was the jumping off point for all of you to get into that world.
You can look at it in a different way. It could be that Einstein simply, what it did, it defined an outer limit. But it was a big jump ahead to that outer limit. And I think many of us spent the rest of the time filling in the space between that outer limit and the things that happened in between.
And bringing that experience to everything
To everything
we
you've
did
done.
after that, absolutely.
So it really is a seminal work in that regard.
But it was that way for us as well.
And
We were the students of the work ourselves. We were as much transformed by the work as the audience was. It's not, it would be misleading to think that we knew what we were doing.
when you did it originally, it had its premiere in Avignon in 1976. And it had it was an immediate sensation. You got a small tour in Europe. You did it at the Festival d'Automne in Paris, and it was a hit there. You got those two performances at the Metropolitan Opera that put on under your own auspices.
Not true.
Oh.
It was a special event presented by the Metropolitan Opera. Please go and look at the original.
Okay.
It's not, we didn't rent the hall. If only we could have. We didn't have that kind of money.
But you were
Jane
still
Herman and Gil.
Anthony Bliss?
Yeah, they were.
But it wasn't part of the Met season. It was a special.
No, it was a Monday.
Special.
Let me correct that as well. It was a special. The Met decided to use their dark nights, Sunday nights, as special events. Jane Herman, who worked there, and Gil Wexner, who was a producer there, were asked to go and find events to fill in those spots. They came and invited us there. We didn't, it never occurred to us to go to the Met. We were totally shocked at the idea. We were the last people to believe it could even happen.
And then you revived it twice in 8-year periods. Is this a work, and now you're reviving it one more time, is it a work that can be revived without your ensemble, without your input, without Wilson, without you, Lucinda? I know Achim Freyer did a production in Stuttgart in the mid-90s as part of doing the three of your three portrait operas. And that wasn't a success. At least I didn't think it was a success. I don't know what you thought about Freyer's production. And can it be done? Can it have a life as a performance piece beyond you?
I don't know. I have no way to know that.
Achim Freyer just used the music, and everything else about the production, it was completely different.
It's totally different. Yeah. He just created
That could be done.
his own scenario.
That could be done.
That could be done. But the Einstein on the Beach that is a collaboration between Philip Glass and Robert Wilson, without the two of you, can that be done?
We're listed as co-authors, and I think that's true.
Right.
How that will play itself out in productions when we're no longer around to cheer it on or to complain, I have no idea. I don't know. Maybe one of the things that I was so very pleased that Pomegranate Arts and Linda Brumbach and all the people here, all the presenters who have gotten behind doing this, was important for us was that it could be seen again. You know, it's important for us to see it again. It's not just for, the 2 or 3 generations of people who couldn't possibly have seen it. They weren't even alive You know, the young people will see it now have no idea what it was. And I don't know what that will be like. I think we're on the edge we're on the horizon right now of that future, and we don't know where it will go. It's a good question. It will be answered by people that aren't even alive right now.
The music, though, you've kept that in your repertoire in the,
yes.
on the ensemble for now 35 years.
Yeah.
You still play
We still play it.
some of that.
So, traditionally, music, that's a good point. Traditionally, the work of the composer would be the work of the opera. If someone wanted to do any work of Verdi, they would take the score and make up everything else. Here, we're talking about authorship, which is based in a broader way. We're talking about authorship, which really emerges from a collaborative process. That was not how opera was ever done. So then the question is, how does work that is collaborative in nature, how does that become transferred? And that I can't say. I suppose that you can have other dances, but then would you take, like the structure that Bob set out, or the way that the dances have emerged and function in the opera, could they be done differently? I mean, I don't know. We won't, presumably we won't be around to be the judges of that. And I think the most important thing for us right now, if I may say, is to see the work now in the context of what's been happening in the last 30 years. That's interesting.
But what about...
And I suspect that what we'll see is that after staking out a kind of, I call it a horizon, a future, a place that theater could go to, and then there's a lot of filling in going on, I think that most things will have seemed more conventional even now. Most theater work is more conventional than what we did 30 years ago.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, one of the things that will, I think right now seem still unconventional is the text. We haven't talked about the text.
Well,
there's
been important changes, Mark, since then. For one thing,
new numbers?
we live in a digital world now. We don't live in a world of technology.
We should just tell them what the text is, maybe, or the way it works.
I use numbers, but that's not so important. The most important texts were the ones that Lucinda and Mr. Johnson and
Mills wrote.
I simply use numbers because that's part of music, but
the solfege.
What?
And the solfege.
The sung parts, the chorus sings, for those who don't know it, are either the numbers counting almost like the way the Indian tabla players will count, or the solfege.
Very quickly,
pitches.
what I was doing basically was I was defining content, form and content as being identical, without going into a long, deep elaboration of that. That the structure and the content were the same. That's all I was doing. It wasn't so important. When I talked about the digital, the technological, what's happened in the last 20 years, just in terms of the way we think digitally, oddly enough, the structure of the music is also based on combinations of 2s and 3s. In the same way that digital technology is based on 1s and 0s. It's a binary system. The musical language of Einstein is binary. Why that happened in '76, I can't tell you, except I picked it up from the Indians, the Indian masters who I studied with, like Ravi Shankar, and that's been true of global music for a long time, that kind of language. It's not known in the West. Now we're talking about, the reason I think that Einstein might become relevant is because it also undertakes to deal with structure in a way that happens to be, perhaps by coincidence, but certainly not by design, but by coincidence. A lot of thinking about structure is happening that way now. The way Bob thinks about form, the way Lucinda thinks about form, the way I think about form, happen to be precursors about the way post-digital structure is thought about. The relevance of Einstein may have more to do with that than anything that happened in between.
And what about imagery as well? I mean, Einstein is an opera of, unbelievably striking imagery.
Unbelievably
And-
creative
and-
person, Bob Wilson.
Right,
What are
but I
you
mean,
talking
that
about?
too is part of the, and it all kind of,
But it's always like that. Image makers are fantastic, creative people. Those images become part of our lives. We live in the midst of it without even knowing where it came from. We go to the theater now, you see Bob Wilson's work all over the place.
did you ever feel that the imagery could be too strong for both of you, that it was taking over, that it took over everything? Or did you just...
I felt the
happen to-
balance was good. I felt the balance of personality, of performer, of movement content, of image, of music. We didn't feel competitive. We were true collaborators in that sense. We worked together on it. And we were, I would think, our collaborations were rather joyful rather than fearful. I found the work of my colleagues stunning. I loved it. It didn't worry me that they would overwhelm the music. After all, I could just turn the volume up, couldn't I?
And which you do sometimes. And Lucinda, had you written text before? I mean, there's one text in there particular that's become quite well known, the air-conditioned supermarket. You want to tell us about where that came from and how you did that? And had you done much work with text before?
Well, in the Judson
In Judson,
Theater,
you had.
and we worked with dialogues that subject matter that at moments had something to do with what we were doing, but for the most part didn't have something to do with what we were doing. I mean, that was the nature of that kind of experience. And the supermarket speech was a request from Bob to come to the studio because he said, we need something about the beach.
It was in the title of the piece.
Nothing has come up about the beach. And I knew Bob well enough not to ask too much more because it would get just more vague of what he wanted. In any case, I just launched into some sort of discussion about the beach, which was completely improvised. And there was one part of it that he liked very much, and which he selected out of my ramblings, and that became the supermarket speech, the air-conditioned supermarket.